Did he pray Mincha Ketana or Mincha Gedolah?
Yeah, just the question. The question is Eliyahu Ha-Navi. Remember, he's the one who built the Mizbeach. That's Mount Carmel, and he called out to Hashem, and fire came down from Shemayim, and it consumed the offering. And the prophets of the Baal called to Hashem. Called to the Baal rather, and nothing happened. And all of the Jewish people that were over the Avodah Zarah, they became Baalei Tshuva, and they proclaimed the words that we say after Yom Kippur, Hashem hu Elokim, Hashem is the only God. This was a great, great tshuva. Just as a little aside, let me point out that there was a Beis Hamikdash at that time, and bringing a korban outside of the Beis Hamikdash is an Isser D'Oraisa. So the Rishonim talk about this question. A Navi is not allowed to violate the Torah. How could Eliyahu Ha-Navi build a Mizbeach in Mount Carmel? And the Rambam derives from here that even though a Navi cannot change a mitzvah, but Horaz Sha'ah, if it's a one-time emergency point to sanctify God's name, it's going to be permitted. And the classic example of Horaz Sha'ah is Eliyahu Bahara Carmel. So halachically, that's a very, very important principle. But the question, but Chazal say that the fire came down from heaven, Bi'alot HaMincha, the time of the Mincha offering. And from here we learn out that although all of our tefillas are good the entire day, but there's a special koach that Mincha has because of Eliyahu Navi. So I'm just explaining your question. So the question is this. We know Mincha is the afternoon prayer, but there are two different zamanim in which you can daven Mincha. The earliest time you can daven Mincha is called Mincha Gedolah, and that is 6.5 hours from sunrise, but the definition of an hour, of course, does not mean 60 minutes, but it means shows zmanios, proportionate hours, measuring from, according to most interpretations, sunrise to sunset. In the winter, an hour might be as short as 45 minutes. In the summer, an hour might be as much as 80 minutes, depending. But 6.5 of those units is called Mincha Gedolah. Mincha Ketana is a much smaller window. It is 2.5 hours before sunset. Again, shows zmanios. And there is a machlokes, lahalacha, when is it best for me to daven mincha? Some take the position that because of the principle of zerizin makdimim lemitzvos, that you try to do a mitzvah as soon as you can, you should do mincha gedolah, as we do in yeshiva. Well, we do it not exactly, but we do it close to Mincha Gedolah because you want to do a mitzvah as soon as you can. This was Rav Chaim Kanevsky's practice as well. Others say that Mincha should actually be closer to the evening, before sunset, of course, but closer to the evening, and therefore Mincha Ketana is actually better. So the question that is being asked is, when Eliyahu Ha-Navi brought down the fire from heaven at the time of Mincha, was it Mincha Gedolah or Mincha Ketana? The truth is, I don't know. I don't know if we have any particular proof, meaning, in a way, we would work backwards, meaning we would kind of say, once you define when is the best time for prayer, that is when we assume the Maisa happened. But I don't think we can prove it from the Maisa itself. So I don't know. Yeah.
Do you have any Shana Rishona advice?
Shana Rishona, yeah. You're still in the first half here. Shana Rishona is a very, very big challenge. In fact, for many of us, Shana Rishona can last much more than 1 year. I'm in my 44th year of Shana Rishona, still learning. But the most important thing really is to make time. Husband and wife have to make time for each other, and that's going to be a challenge. You know, people, number one, are busy, obviously, whether it's yeshiva, whether it's college, whether it's work. And if, God willing, a person gets blessed with children, which, you know, obviously that's a big bracha, but as wonderful as that is, and of course it's absolutely wonderful, but it's also going to make it increasingly more difficult to kind of relate to each other as husband and wife. So you have to be sure to make time, let's say at least to have, let's say, breakfast and supper together or whatever it is, and take walks and have what's called date nights. Because, you know, in courtship, you know, we're talking, we're interacting. Once we get married, you know, we stop talking to each other, and, you know, it really should not be that way. And the point basically is to stay in touch and communicate. And it doesn't have to be a long time. You know, it's very, very interesting. You know, one of the things that men are afraid of sometimes is, gee, if I start talking to my wife, you know, it's going to be a 12-hour conversation. You know, what do I do? So there's a saying. A friend of my wife once said to my wife. She was saying about her marriage. She said to her husband, "If you give me a half an hour, I'll take 5 minutes. If you only give me 5 minutes, I'm going to need a half an hour." Meaning, if you show that you're there when your wife needs you, you know, you'll find that it doesn't have to be all day type of thing. But you do have to be available. You have to be there. You have to show that you're there when you're needed. Yeah?
Why is it that a lot of frum people are against having pet animals?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. From Jews and pets. So obviously, it's apparent that most Haredi people do not have dogs. Although it's interesting, I believe the Alter of Kelem's son, who was a great, great Baal Musar, he had a pet dog. He had a dog, wow, which is extremely unusual in Lithuania among the Litvische Yidden to have a dog. But he thought it was a way of training himself and his family in kindness and in taking care of. So dogs in particular, but really any pet can be a wonderful, wonderful character builder. And often I tell parents if their child has difficulty, is depressed or has difficulty making friends, that a dog might be a wonderful, wonderful thing. So why don't you find that so prevalent? So part of it actually is historical, and I'm sure you've seen pictures. In the Nazi concentration camps, they would use these big dogs to attack Jews. But the truth is, it goes way before World War II. You can go back to hundreds and hundreds of years when Jews were under the Polish nobility. And the Poritz was the landowner, and all of the Jews were working, as slaves for the Poritz. So a lot of this was, there were dogs. There were vicious dogs. They would sick on Jews. And particularly if your ancestors are Eastern European, Poland or the like, there's almost, I'm not going to call it genetic, but there's almost a genetic fear of animals, going back to the fact that these animals used to attack Jews. Other than that, there are other issues, of course. There are halachic issues in owning pets that can sometimes be complicated. Number one, issues of are pets muktzah. Now, this is actually a huge halachic discussion. Most poskim, based on the Gemara, have taken the position that pet animals are muktzah on Shabbos, which means you would not be allowed to move them, based on the fact that the Gemara says balei chayim are muktzah. Now, there is the shita of Rabbeinu Tam that's very important. That he understands when Chazal say animals are muktzah, that refers to work animals, farm animals. That does not refer to pets that are like toys. Rabbeinu Tam considers a pet to be like a toy. But most poskim do not follow Rabbeinu Tam. Rav Moshe Feinstein, it's very, very interesting. In the Igros Moshe volumes that were published when Rav Moshe was alive, he took the mainstream position that pet animals are muktzah. However, in the volumes of Igros Moshe that came out after his death, he seems to have changed his mind. And therefore, the latest tshuva we actually have is, he followed Rabbeinu Tam, that pets are not muktzah. But the problem is, there's a huge, huge argument whether we consider the post-mortem Igros Moshes to be authentic or to be forged or whatever it is. So there are people, I'm not expressing an opinion on it, there are people who will not use those later volumes because Rav Moshe did not approve of their printing, and who knows what was going on and the like. So one issue is muktzah. That's going to be a big issue with a dog, or maybe a cat less so, but a dog always wants to be carried or petted or the like. Another issue is, even though in theory, even if a dog is muktzah, you could walk the dog if you put a leash on it. But if there's no erev, there may be a problem of carrying. And a third issue, which is a very, very big issue, is the issue of sterilization, spaying. The halacha is you're not allowed to spay animals. So if you get a dog that's already been spayed, that's your best bet. But if you buy a dog and the dog then has to be neutered or should be neutered, or dog or a cat, and that's a major, major problem, halachically there are a lot of complications. How and if I can get my dog neutered. So there are halachic issues. So there is the emotional connection to oppression, and then there is the issue of Shabbos and the issue of spaying, which are halachic issues. And then, other than that, I'm not sure. Again, I don't know if there's necessarily any shita against it, but you are correct that it's less common in the Haredi world. It is more common in the more modern Orthodox world. So you will see that. Yeah.
So speaking of the modern Orthodox world,
Yeah.
I spoke to a former Rosh Yeshiva who was involved in New York, was involved in Kiruv work for many years. So Agavorcha, he was saying that, in his opinion, that the modern Orthodox, they're dying. It's really for many years, and it's just going to continue that way. And the kids are either going to become very right-wing or extreme, or they're going to just not leave the fold, or leave the fold. So I was wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah. So I get in trouble with this. Occasionally I poke a very, very gentle criticism of modern Orthodox. But I guess members of my former show, many of whom are modern Orthodox, or so they identify, and they attacked me for turning against my show and turning against my kehillah. Again, I won't call it hate mail because these are people that I like, but nevertheless, I was very, very surprised that things that I thought were innocuous, little joke, sometimes can hurt people, and that's something that we all have to keep in mind when we try to make a joke, that we don't hurt people's feelings. But the issue of modern Orthodox, the problem,
What's causing it?
No, so let me explain something. The problem is that there are two definitions of modern Orthodox. I don't even mean centrist. By the way, modern Orthodox is no longer modern Orthodox. It used to be modern Orthodox, and then to the left was open Orthodox, which is pretty extreme.
Yeah.
But open Orthodox took the name modern Orthodox, so modern Orthodox took the name centrist Orthodox. So when you say modern Orthodox, you need to know, are you talking about what is presently called modern Orthodox that used to be open Orthodox? Or are you talking about what used to be called modern Orthodox that today is centrist Orthodox? That's one thing to keep in mind, because open Orthodox, which is now called modern Orthodox, is very, 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 very much to the left, and one can really discuss whether it's Orthodox at all. They have people, at least within the movement, that support gay marriage, and the like. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, let's say, Yeshiva University Orthodox. Right. Maybe that's even the best, most descriptive term. Yeshiva University Orthodox, which used to be called, as they say, modern Orthodox. Now it's called centrist Orthodox, etc. So here's the problem. Within the Yeshiva University type of Orthodoxy, the Young Israel Orthodoxy, many people, you might have grown up, I grew up in a Young Israel synagogue, kind of, modern Orthodox. They believe in college, for example, secular studies, they believe in having a profession. But there are two types of modern Orthodox within that chevra. There is the Rav Soloveitchik, Norman Lamb, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein type of paradigm, in which they literally were intellectually committed totally to Torah and mitzvos, but they saw the value of secular wisdom, and they tried to incorporate the insights of secular wisdom in their avodas Hashem. That group is very small, very intellectual, very brilliant, and very meticulous in halacha. Now maybe they'll have different psukim of halacha, but that's because they went through the sugya and they came to their own conclusions. So in terms of frumkeit, religiosity and spirituality, those leaders of modern Orthodox are every bit as spiritual and ruchani as Haredi, even if their conclusions are different. Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Lichtenstein, Norman Lamb. However, there's another aspect of modern Orthodox, which basically represents a certain leniency in halacha. So a person might say, oh, I'm modern Orthodox, so I don't have a problem with mixed swimming. Or we eat dairy in restaurants without hashgacha because we're modern Orthodox. Now that's a very different thing. That's no longer the Rav Soloveitchik modern Orthodox of let's learn, philosophy and see how it enriches our understanding of Torah. Rather, it's a notion that maybe halacha is less important than it ought to be. Now, the truth of the matter is, therefore, modern Orthodox, and by the way, this criticism of modern Orthodoxy is not just uttered by me. This was uttered by Rav Soloveitchik and Rabbi Norman Lamb and Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. I mean, they were the ones who were criticizing their own movement. Right? It's not from the Charedim on the outside. The leaders of modern Orthodoxy saw a very unhappy development in which modern Orthodoxy became synonymous with less Yiras Shamayim, less emphasis on Limud HaTorah, and less Zehirut in Halacha. And it's almost two different movements. I mean, you have the philosophically modern Orthodox, and then you have the behaviorally modern Orthodox. Now, the truth of the matter is, both of them are on the decline, numerically. And again, I'm not making a negative judgment. I'm just describing an empirical reality. And part of it is that a lot of the children of modern Orthodox people, because one of the tenets of modern Orthodoxy, centrist Orthodoxy, is they tend to be very pro-Eretz Yisrael, pro-Zionist and the like. So all of them will send their kids to learn in Israel for a year after high school. Again, maybe in less Haredi yeshivas, but going to Israel is the requirement. That's what you got to do. Now, once people come to Eretz Yisrael, they're exposed, just as you're exposed, to a very intense type of life. So many of the children of modern Orthodox themselves become more Haredi, more committed to learning, and as a result, reject a little bit the modernity of their families. That's a very common thing. Just as, to give you another example of this, the Hirschian congregation, right, Rav Hirsch, to some degree, had certain aspects of modern Orthodoxy in terms of Torah and Derech Eretz, combining secular education. And they did not believe in full-time kollel or full-time yeshiva. And when they started their kehillah in Washington Heights, it was built on Hirschian foundations, Rav Breuer. And yet, many of the children of the founders of the Washington Heights Shul are in Lakewood or whatever it is, which, it's a wonderful thing, but to some degree it's a betrayal of those foundational principles. So to some degree that is what's happening in the modern Orthodox community. And then of course you have the opposite, and that is, if the modern Orthodox is lax in halacha, the laxity tends to be increased in the next generation. So you're going to lose on both sides. Now, of course, the side that makes them more frum is not really a loss, it's just a difference of emphasis. The other side is a very, very significant loss. I can tell you this, I was a rabbi in Silver Spring, Maryland, and University of Maryland's campus is nearby, and that has many, many Jewish students. And I was frankly amazed, a kid who went through 12 years of Jewish education from kindergarten through 12th grade, and even had a year in Israel. And after that year, they go to a secular college. There are kids who stop keeping Shabbos within one semester. It's unbelievable that could be lost so quickly. Going to day college, because there are parents who think, my kid doesn't have to go to YU, better to get him into Harvard or Penn or Columbia or even University of Maryland, although I don't know why that's considered better than YU. And they think there's no problem, my kid had 12 years of education, what could go wrong? You would be quite amazed as to what could go wrong. I'm not referring to he doesn't learn Daf Yomi anymore. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about not keeping Shabbos, not wearing tefillin, not davening. So, in a sense, there is a bleeding within the modern Orthodox. But I don't know if I would, say that they're not going to last. I think there will always be a core. Oh, I should also add one other thing. The problem is YU was always the flagship of modern Orthodoxy. That was its pride and joy. The problem, now some say it's not a problem, but the problem is that many of the Rebbeim of YU, who themselves were students of YU, are kind of much more to the right than the original philosophy of YU was. So whether it's Rav Mordechai Willig, whether it's Rav Herschel Schechter, whether it's Rav Yaakov Neuberger, they're products of YU themselves, but they're very, 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 very traditional. So in a sense, modern Orthodoxy is almost self-destroying itself by moving more to the right. In fact, that is actually why open Orthodoxy was created to correct that tendency, although I would not call it a correction in any way. So it's a bit of a complicated dynamic. Things change all the time. When I was a single man, I was in Baltimore, so I would go to New York to date. This is what we did. So I spent a lot of Shabboses at YU. I spent a lot of Shabboses at YU because I would be dating in New York, and I spent Shabbos in YU. And YU is an interesting place because there's a lot of discussions, because since YU is both the yeshiva and a college, so they're always discussing, like, what's the role of secular education? Interesting discussion. So I was wearing a hat. So I remember one day, it was like Sunday, a guy from YU sat next to me. He thought I was a student at YU, and he started telling me, so many problems here. This place is secular, and people don't have Yiras Shamayim, and they're not committed to Torah. We frum guys have to stick together and, be stark. So I just said, I'm not a student here. I'm from Ner Yisrael. He said, oh, yeah, you guys don't respect us. We have the greatest learning, like immediately. As soon as I wasn't part of YU, he immediately had to defend YU. When he thought I was part of YU, he was telling me everything that was wrong about YU. But it was interesting because ambivalence is always interesting, although it's uncomfortable, meaning when you have a definite view of things are black and white. So you're in your black or you're in your white. When you're in gray, there's a lot of confusion, but it made for very interesting discussions, debates. What is the role of Torah? What is the role of Chachma, Torah Umada? How do you remain a Yarei Shemayim when you're still exposed to the modern world? How do you balance it? So I can tell you that although indeed there were many, many students at YU who were not balancing it in a proper way, unfortunately, but there were and there are many, many students who really work very, very hard at this. And, we should respect that. And I can just tell you that I spoke at YU maybe one time, must have been maybe 10 or 12 years ago during Elul. And I walked into the Beis Medrash at night, and it was absolutely indistinguishable from Mir or, what you might call a black hat yeshiva. Unusual. And people told me that 10 years before, if you walked into YU at night, the Beis Medrash would be empty. So things have changed. So in a sense, if modern Orthodoxy is withering away, to some degree, it's in a good direction. So that's kind of the general story. Yeah.
If I was a C-section, when Mashiach comes, when the firstborns can do the avoda again, will I be able to do the avoda?
Yeah. So the question is, we know that originally the Bechor, the firstborn, was given the zechus of the avoda in the Beis Hamikdash, and because of the sin of the golden calf and other reasons, that was taken away from the firstborn, and it was given to Aaron and the Kohanim and the Leviim. There are some traditions from the Arizal, it's not really in the Gemara, but it's based on the Zohar, that when Mashiach comes at some point, the avoda will go back to the firstborn. Now we know for Pidyon Haben, there's a requirement that the obligation of redeeming the firstborn is only if the firstborn is born vaginally through the rechem, but if it is a cesarean section, such a firstborn does not need a Pidyon Haben. So the question that was raised is, if the person doesn't have that distinction of needing a pidyon haben, but he's born, he's still a bechor, will he have the zechus of the avoda limosa Mashiach? I need to research that. I'm not sure I have the answer, but my instinct is he would, and the reason is the following. Pidyon haben depends on being the firstborn of the mother. So even if the father had children from another wife, if this is the mother's first delivery, there must be a pidyon haben, and the Torah is makbid that it comes derech harechem. And if the mother had children before, even though it's the father's firstborn, there is no pidyon haben. But it seems, in terms of the avoda in the Beis Hamikdash, that depended on being the firstborn of the father. So as a result, even if mom had children before, I think the firstborn of the father would have the zechus of the avoda. So I would say that a cesarean is not going to be inferior to not even being the firstborn of the mother, and therefore, as long as you're a bechor me'av, I think you would have the zechus of avoda. But I'll try to check that for sure. Yeah.
5 out of the 6 Siddharma Mishnayos are Lashon Rab, except for Seder Moed, which seems to be Moedim. Why is it not Moedim? Why is it?
That's an interesting question. We have the 6 orders of the Mishnah, and everything is Rabim, right? Zeraim, Nashim, Nezikin, Kodshim, Taharot, right? Everything is plural. Moed, time, right? Moed. So l'chayra, just to be consistent with the designation of everything else, we should call it moadim. That's a very excellent question. I never thought of that. One thing I can tell you actually is that the names for the orders of the Mishnah, I believe, are not in Chazal. They come from the Gaonim and the like. And in fact, in some Tshuvas HaGaonim, the Seder Moed is called Zamanim, just like in the Rambam, right? In the Rambam section of the Mishnah Torah dealing with Yomim Tovim is called Zamanim. So according to that Tshuvas HaGaonim, it's called Seder Zamanim. You actually don't have a kasha, but still, nevertheless, your kasha is still a good kasha. Like the Arminog that we call it Moed, why don't we call it Moadim? I don't know. The one thing I can think of is there's an idea in Kabbalah that the Kedusha of all the Yomim Tovim is kind of an overspill from Shabbos, meaning to say the Eibishter is Mekadosh Shabbos, and then the holiness of Shabbos spills over and is Niskadosh. So maybe the remez of Moed is that all sacred Zamanim get their Yanika, they get their nourishment from one central Makor. But that would depend on that thought al pi Kabbalah. So I'll think about that. It's a very good question. Yeah.
I was recently in the shul of the Maharal.
Wow.
Yeah, it was very special. And everyone, a lot of the tours there are not Jewish. They were talking about the Golem. And there are things that are going around on those tours that I was overhearing. Some people say it was going around killing the town. Some people say it was doing this and that.
Yeah.
What was the purpose of creating him?
Yeah. So it's funny, the Maharal was a great Gadol. He's known, of course, for his books on Agadata and Jewish philosophy, many, many volumes. But he was also a great posek and a great halachic authority. He was the Rebbe of the Kli Yakar. He was the Rebbe of the Tosfos Yom Tov, who wrote great commentaries on the Mishnah and on the Rush. And they all speak of him with great reverence. So Maharal was not only great in Hashkafa and in Agadata, the Maharal was great in Halacha, one of the great poskim. Interesting, as a little aside, the Maharal lived at the time when the Shulchan Aruch came out. Maharal was against the idea of the Shulchan Aruch. Very, very fascinating. Maharal did not like the idea. He had great covet for Rav Yosef Karo, that wasn't the issue. But he was against the idea of a Shulchan Aruch. Because the Maharal held, his understanding of halacha was that every posek should look at the Gemara and look at the Rishonim and look at the commentaries, and based on his understanding of the Gemara and the Rishonim, should paskin for his community. And there shouldn't be like one central book that tells everybody how to paskin. He envisioned halacha, until we have a Sanhedrin, which is a final body, as a very decentralized system. He says there should not be one definitive source of halacha. And everything should always go back to the Gemara with all of the different Rishonim to understand. So he was against the idea of the centralization of the Shulchan Aruch. He also argued that this would promote superficiality of learning, that instead of people going through a sugya to figure out what the halacha would be, they would just open the book and get a psak. Of course, today the Shulchan Aruch itself has so many commentaries, but in the Maharal's time, the Shulchan Aruch was like a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, basically. It just kind of gave you the rules. So the Maharal was phenomenally great, and yet many, many people only know one thing about the Maharal. They know the story of the Maharal and the Golem. Now, what's the Golem? The Golem was like an artificially created man, not really a human being, but who doesn't talk. Golems can't talk, but they get activated through the Shem HaMeforish, and this Golem was supposedly like the Maharal's Superman that would beat up the Goyim or frustrate the blood libels, defend the town against enemies and accusations. And the Golem was a very superpower, heroic figure that the Maharal decommissioned at the end of his life by withdrawing the shame of Hashem that was in him. And according to tradition, the Golem is locked up. I hope you didn't go to the attic. In the attic, the locked attic of the Maharal's shul. And there are stories that say that the Nazis broke into the attic in World War II, and the Golem somehow woke up from its sleep and took care of those Nazis as well. The Frierdiker Rebbe, Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rav Yosef Yitzchak, actually claims he was in the attic and he saw the sleeping Golem and the like. Here is the problem. Maharal died, I don't have the exact date, but the Maharal died in the 1500s. We hear nothing about the Golem till the end of the 1800s. 300 years after the Maharal dies, a rabbi discovers what he says was a long-lost manuscript in a German library that was said to be written by the Maharal's son-in-law, describing all of these stories with the Golem. And there is no other source that corroborates these stories, and no mention of it for more than 300 years after the Maharal's death. I should also add that the rabbi that claimed to have discovered this in a long-lost library already is known to have been a forger of books, meaning we know it from other situations. So as a result, there are many who have said that the story of the Golem is a Baba Maisa. It literally is not true. It was a made-up story that captured the imagination, not only of Jews, but captured the imagination of non-Jews. In fact, there's a lot of non-Jewish literature about the Golem. It became a very fascinating motif in Eastern European literature, even in the non-Jewish world. In fact, as you know, and if you were in Prague, as you know, Maharal is kind of popular in non-Jewish circles too. He had legendary meetings with the emperor and the like. I think he's on a bridge. A statue of him is on a bridge in Prague, and the like. He became like a folk hero because of this. So on the other hand, Lubavitcher Rebbe said he saw the Golem, so what am I supposed to say to that? So all I can tell you is that the historicity of the Golem story is very, very, very much in doubt, and we just don't know. But, what do they say about Hasidic stories? Of course, Maharal was not a Chassid, he was before the Baal Shem Tov. But the Maharal was the great-great-grandfather of the Baal Tanya. So quite literally, he's grandfathered in. He's like an honorary Chassid. even though he's before the Baal Shem Tov. But they say about Hasidic stories, if you believe that they are literally true, you're a fool, you're a shaita. If you believe they couldn't happen, you're an apikoros. So, maybe the Maharal didn't make a golem, but I have to believe he could have made one if he wanted to. Meaning, it's not taking away from his madrega, but whether he actually made a golem is a very, very big question. As they say, problem is, there is no evidence of the golem until like the 1800s, and not a single contemporary of Maharal and none of his students ever mentioned this. Now you'd think something like that would not have been a secret for 300 years. Yeah.
What is the, so to speak, ranking system of stacking Seforim on a table, different types of Seforim, and if I had a notebook filled with notes from, Kodesh Shiurim, where would that fit?
Yeah, so the only ranking system we actually have is in the Gemara Megillah that says that a Torah should be on top of Nevi'im, and Nevi'im should be on top of Kesuvim, and that's all it is, Torah, Nevi'im, Kesuvim. There is no ranking for Mishnah or even Siddur. Now the custom is anything that has the Shem Hashem is higher than things without the Shem Hashem. So the custom would be you would put a Siddur on top of a Gemara, but l'chayra, that's not a halacha. That's not really a halacha. Now, I do want to mention a very interesting psak of the Aruch HaShulchan. Very interesting psak, which most people don't follow. He says the requirement of Torah on top of Nevi'im and Kesuvim only applies to klaf, things written on parchment. When things are printed, the Aruch HaShulchan says all printed books are the same kedusha. So according to the Aruch HaShulchan, you can put a Gemara on top of a Chumash. Not a problem. That's a very important kula to at least be aware of. It seems, however, that the minhag is not like the Aruch HaShulchan in this regard, so we still favor the Chumash over a Gemara, etc. However, Gemara over Rishonim, that I don't think anyone's makbid on, meaning to say, I can put a Rambam on top of a Gemara, that's not going to be a problem. Now, in terms of your notebook, if your notebook has Chidushei Torah, I believe you could treat it, even though it's obviously not equal to the Gemara, but you can treat it like any work of Torah Shabbal Peh, that you can put it on top of a Gemara and the like, but you would put a Chumash or something having Shem Hashem on top of that, unless you follow the Aruch HaShulchan, in which case everything would be mutter.
What about when, let's say, carrying books to class? Is it okay to sort of break the minhag while carrying it if the size of the different Seforim are...
Yeah, so that's a good question about carrying, right? Because when things are carried, they get shifted around, and something's on top of a smaller book of greater kedusha. Smaller book of lesser kedusha. It's easier to put on top of a larger book with greater kedusha. So there, I think you could be somech on the Aruch HaShulchan, and that's the one case where you could follow that leniency, and because it's a printed book, you could be makel on it. Okay? Yeah.
So there's a saying, Maisa Hava Simon. I don't
Right.
know where the source of it is, and I don't know to what extent you can say it's always that whatever happens, whenever it happens, that we can look back in Tanakh or elsewhere and learn from that and somehow use that as a way of dealing with the current crisis, as it were. So if that's the case, can we look back in Jewish history somewhere and say, we have a similar situation way back then, and the solution was so-and-so, and therefore what's going on there to Yisrael, we should try to emulate what happened then, or is it completely out of the box, what's going on now? We don't really have anything in Jewish history that we can say, this is the Eitzah, this is... The famous principle, Masa Avo Shimon Labanim, what happens to the forefathers is a sign for their children, for the future generations, is a chazal, it is a medrash, and Ramban in particular, throughout Chumash Bereshis,
uses it to illustrate many, many events. There are two different meanings, though, which are not totally the same. One meaning is pedagogic. In other words, I learn from how our forefathers behaved how I should behave. The other is prophetic, meaning that which happened to our forefathers, Hashem is foreshadowing what's going to happen to us. That's a different idea there. Just like Avram getting wealth from Paro foreshadows the Jewish people getting wealth when they leave Mitzrayim. But you're focusing not on that aspect of it. You're focusing on, can I learn from the Maisa of us? The answer is absolutely. This is, the Alter Rebbe used to say, there's an old saying, you got to live with the times. And he said what that means is you live with the Parshas HaShavua, meaning you look at the Chumash and you apply it. The problem is, though, that you need a lot of wisdom for that, meaning to say lessons are sometimes ambiguous. They can be subject to different interpretations, maybe depending on how the Meforshim understood it, depending how Chazal understood it. And you also will have difficulty matching up your present situation with what is being described. So in theory, if you're asking me, can I look at the past of our Avos as a guide to how I am supposed to behave? The answer is yes. And to talk about something being very new, even something like the Holocaust, which was unmatched in terms of its severity, but in many, many ways, Ein kol chadash tachas hashemesh. Koheles says, there is nothing new. Everything's already happened. It's now a question of more or less, not fundamentally different. When people talk about October 7, as if, October 7 is a tragedy, and of course our heart goes out to all of the hostages that are still there, and of course those who were brutally murdered and their families. So I don't mean to diminish it. But the line that people like to say, that October 7 was the greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Well, that is true in a literal sense, but only in the most literal sense. You're comparing 6 million to 1,200. Now, it's true that there was nothing as high as 1,200 since the Holocaust, but to kind of have a lashon that this is comparable to the Holocaust. The worst day since the Holocaust. I think that's a very misleading thing. So this is a tragedy. And again, our heart, we have to pray to Hashem for rachamim. Right. But it's not a new tragedy. We've been through worse. So I do very much agree with you that we certainly look to the Maisa of Siman Labanim. But as I say, you really need Gedolah Torah to kind of identify the similarities and point out the differences. I'll give you one interesting example about this. This is pre-Holocaust. This is after World War I. Actually, it's interesting. This often happens to me. I often, without thinking about it, mention a vort from a Gadol, and it happens to be the week of his yahrzeit. Now, I'm going to tell you something from Meir Simcha, but I happen to know that this is the week of his yahrzeit. So I'll tell you a thought of Meir Simcha that ties into your question very much. Meir Simcha died in 1926, before Hitler. But in the aftermath of World War I, when many Jewish communities were decimated and in exile, etc., so somebody proposed that we collect all of the Sifrei Torah from the small villages and we bring them to central places in big cities like Warsaw or the like for safekeeping, so that all of these Torahs will be in one place and we can protect them and we can secure them, and then the communities after the war will be able to reclaim them. So Rav Meir Simcha said it was dangerous and irresponsible to put all of your assets in one place. And he brought a raya from Yaakov Avinu. When Yaakov Avinu is about to meet Esav Harasha, Yaakov Avinu divided up his camp, because what did he say? If Esav comes and smites one of my group, the other group will survive. And Rav Meir Simcha says this is the lesson, that you don't want to bring all of Klal Yisrael or all of the Sifrei Torah in one place. And Kachave, what happened was that in spite of Reb Meir Simcha, many Torahs were brought to a central location. And what happened was, in the Russian Revolution, the Torahs were destroyed. They brought them to Petersburg, whatever it would be, and the Russians, 1917. So that's an example of looking at Yaakov Avinu as an example of how to behave. Yeah.
What exactly is nivel peh? Is that saying a swear word in English or any other language? What exactly does it mean, nivel peh?
Yeah, so the word or the expression nivel peh kind of means a disgusting mouth, speech that is disgusting, but of course disgusting is not a defined term itself. So generally speaking, it refers to what we would call profanity or obscenity that is primarily connected with sexual functions. That's kind of how it's defined. So we would call it swear words and like, but really it has to be, swear words that are connected to sexual functions. So the typical four-letter words would often qualify like that. And that's called a nivel peh. Nivel peh is a bad thing. It's not so obvious, though. It's easy to say it's a bad thing, it's not so good. It's not so pashut to identify what exactly is so bad about it. It goes back to a general question. Do we regard sexuality as dirty? Do we regard it as so derogatory, as so evil, that just mentioning it, you contaminate your soul? Surely that's not the case. In fact, there's a kuntris that is ascribed to the Ramban, although many say the Ramban didn't write it, it was someone else, but a Makubal wrote it. It's called the Igeres HaKodesh, the Holy Letter, which makes the very, very interesting point that all of the halachas of modesty, reticence, tznius, which kind of distance ourselves from yichud, negia, right, that distance ourselves from sexuality, is not because sexuality is shameful or denigrating or something bad, but the other way around. It is holy and elevated, sanctified. So you don't want to desecrate it outside of a context of kedusha, like marriage. Marriage is called kedushin, right? Kedushin. So our view of what you might call sexual intimacy is not that it's something negative or degrading, but it's something so holy that we shouldn't violate it by taking it outside of its holiness. So it seems, based on that nivel peh is kind of taking something that is supposed to be very, very kadosh and desecrating it. So this may be not the right way of saying it. It's almost like taking Hashem's name in vain, meaning nivel peh is similar to taking Hashem's name in vain, in which you're taking something kadosh and you're violating it. This might be the same getter. So that would be the definition of nivel peh. Yeah.
Just you asked to say before about zmוניות.
Yeah.
So how do we take, if I wanted to see exactly throughout the year, so from January, February, March, April, May, how do you actually find out how long the Shah is?
Yeah. So there actually is a big machlokas. This is a very fascinating area of halacha, and one could spend a lot of time on this. And whenever you look at a Jewish calendar, even a Jewish calendar that's very complete, you need to examine the methodology they used in their computations, because it may very well be Plag HaMincha and all sorts of things are based on certain assumptions, which themselves are machloksim. So, show zmוניות, this is the famous concept of the relative hour, that an hour is not 60 minutes, it is 1/12 of the daytime period, which could be anywhere between, as I say, in the winter, 45 minutes, to the summer, 75. I think 75 is the longest hour that you're going to have. And that's very relevant for Zman Kriyas Shema, which is 3 hours of the day, and Zman Tefillah, that is 4 hours of the day, and for Mincha Gedolah, that's 6.5 hours, etc. Show zmוניות is very, very important. So the question becomes, you take your daylight and you divide it into 12, and 1/12 is your hour. What do we mean by daylight? What are the two extremes that you're measuring? So this is where you get into a huge machlokas. The shita of the Gra is you measure from sunrise to sunset. And 1/12 of the period between sunrise and sunset is a halachic hour. Now, that's relatively easy to calculate. But even then, it's not so simple, because even calculating nates and shkia, are you looking at sea level or where you are? For example, if you're surrounded by mountains, your sunrise is later and your sunset is earlier if you're in a valley. Right? So do you look at your actual sunrise, sunset? Or do you look at it, what it would be if the mountains were removed? Big machlokas. So when you look at your calendars, you got to know. For example, Yerushalayim itself, on one hand we have an elevation, on the other hand we also have mountains which block the sun. So sunset actually occurs a little earlier in Yerushalayim. You're talking about 3 to 4 minutes earlier than it would be at sea level. So I'll leave that aside for a moment. But according to the Vilna Gaon, you measure sunrise to sunset, which would mean on an equinox day, which is 12 hours from sunrise to sunset, an hour will be 60 minutes. Twice a year, an hour will be 60 minutes. The spring equinox and the fall equinox. However, other shitas say that you don't measure from sunrise to sunset. You measure from Amud HaShachar, from dawn, until the star's coming out. Now, that's going to already get you into a morass, because each of those points has its own machlokas. But let's go with the simplest, that Amud HaShachar is 72 minutes earlier, and Seisa Kochavim is 72 minutes later. So, but that itself may change based on time of year. So the basic halacha follows the Gra here, that we go sunrise to sunset, but some will calculate it from an earlier point. This actually explains the most common example that we see in Zman Kriya Shema. In Zman Kriya Shema, you'll see 2 times for Zman Kriya Shema. You'll see something called the Zaman of the Magen Avraham, and then you'll see the Zaman of the Gra, the Zaman of the Vilna Gaon. And the Zaman of the Vilna Gaon is always later than the Zaman of the Magen Avraham, around between half an hour and 40 minutes later than the Zaman of the Magen Avraham. What is that based on? The answer is very simple. The Zman Kriya Shema is you have to read the Shema of the morning before the end of 3 hours, 3 shows Samaniyos. Like the Gra, you start counting your shows Samaniyos from sunrise. Like the Magen Avraham, you start counting your shows Samaniyos 72 minutes earlier. So as a result, the day will be longer, like the Magen Avraham. In fact, even on an equinox day, that is 12 hours of sunrise to sunset, your show Samaniyos is still going to, according to the Magen Avraham, there's never a time that an hour is going to be 60 minutes, because even in an equinox day, it's a longer day. It's only like the Vilna Gaon that you'll have a 60-minute hour. So that's why the Magen Avraham's time is earlier. Again, it's a little complicated because it's earlier, but the hour is longer. You see how it is? Meaning like this. The Magen Avraham starts his show Samaniyos from an earlier time. But because his day is longer, the number of minutes in the hour is going to be longer. That's why, even though the Magen Avraham is starting 72 minutes early, his Zaman is not 72 minutes earlier, because he has a longer show, Samaniyos, which will give you more time for Shema. But that is the basis of the 2 times for Kriya Shema. Yeah.
Yeah. So, as a brief introduction, very brief before I ask my question, I understand that Anthony Manning gave
Anthony Manning, yeah.
gave a series of talks on halachas of various aspects of war at the OU Center in Carmel. I only attended one, and it was not related to hostage crisis. It was other matters. And also, as an aside, the Supreme Court of the United States, and I imagine other Supreme Courts elsewhere, I guess Israel too, there are certain, I don't know if it's explosive issues that the Supreme Court doesn't want to deal with, and therefore they don't accept. They
Right.
talk about that. So are there Gedolah Yisrael today who Halacha would say, would either say it's this way or it's that way as far as, is this preempt, or should, the hostages you have to have a ceasefire, you have to let these hostages go, or is it the other way that no, you can't let them go because then you're getting all the terrorists out?
Yeah, so right, yes, it is. So let me just say that this issue of hostage deals, getting hostages by ceasefires, or getting hostages by prisoner exchange programs, which Israel has done in the past, is a subject of enormous halachic controversy based on Gemara and Gittin. I myself have given 10 hours or more of classes on this. The Mishnah in Gittin prohibits paying excessive ransoms for kidnapped Jews, lest you encourage future hostage taking in the future. And we, of course, know that Israel, which has released 1,000 terrorists to get one Gilad Shalit back, well, among the terrorists it's released was none other than Sinwar, the head of Hamas, who masterminded October 7. So on one hand, there's a tremendous mitzvah to ransom captives and a mitzvah to save lives. On the other hand, when by saving these lives you're going to be endangering a future population, perhaps in much greater numbers than the people that you're saving. So what does halacha say you do under these circumstances? So all I can say right now is it is a huge machlokas, but the consensus of most of the poskim who have addressed the issue, now that's not most of the poskim, but most who have addressed the issue, is that we have to get the hostages back, no matter what, even if that means compromising the military effort. And the basis of that is that they are in a definitive state of danger, and the dangers that will materialize by ceasing fire are unknown probabilities, and halacha says you favor the certainty over the unknown probability. I will say that Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, of course he's not alive, but many, many years ago, did opine that in a state of war the opposite is the case. His argument was that when you wage war against an enemy, by definition, you put human lives at risk. That's what waging war means. Some of the people who are at risk are the chayolim, and frankly, other people at risk may be civilians who are, in a sense, part of the military effort that's needed to eradicate the enemy. Now, this sounds very hard. I mean, how could I look a mother and say this? But the idea is, if in order to kill Hamas, we will not be able to rescue your son, then just like any chayal, this is a sacrifice on behalf of this cause. So all I can tell you is it is a huge, huge machlokas. Emotionally, it is a gut-wrenching problem. I mean, whether you're a rabbi or a prime minister or a minister of defense or a general, how do you look a mother in the eyes and say, I'm sorry, we are not going to do any deals with Hamas because that would endanger the population in the future, even if that means they're going to shoot your son. Very hard, but from a cold, logical, even halachic standpoint, there is a strong basis. But as I indicated, yeah. No, that's correct. But I say that itself wouldn't bother me that much, because even if it's a suffix, we would do what we can because of the case of doubt. There was a mother. A mother of a hostage. I'm not sure if her son is still alive or not, but this was months ago. This was 8 months ago. She was actually very much against any hostage deal. And somebody said, I'm sorry, she wasn't the mother out, she was just the person who was just against it. So somebody said, what if it would have been your son? What would you have done? So she said an interesting thing. I would have gone to the prime minister. I would have screamed, I would have yelled, I would have demanded that he do something to release my son. And then I would hope he wouldn't listen to me. You see what's going on? Very difficult. That's why, Netanyahu does not have an easy job. Because the point is, there are two goals here. And the goals, in spite of his political rhetoric, the goals are contradictory. Goal number one is get the hostages home. Goal number two is prosecute the war against Hamas until you destroy them. To some degree, this is what we call the tarte de sasre. Because the more we bomb and bomb and bomb and bomb and bomb and bomb, the more likely it's going to be that hostages are going to be killed, either by Hamas or, God forbid, even by us. Sinwar is in some tunnel there, when he's not disguising himself as a woman, but in his tunnel, he is, the way they describe it, he is surrounded by hostages. That's the logical. If you want to get me, you're going to have to kill them. So, what do? Rescue the hostages or destroy Hamas? You might not be able to do both. Right? You want to rescue the hostages, then you get into deals of releasing prisoners, strengthening Hamas, ceasefires, where they could rebuild in a very short amount of time. So this is really not easy. It's really, really, really not easy. It's gut-wrenching. And as I say, halachically, it's also a very, very complicated discussion. Yeah?
Why do we dip bread in salt when we say hamotzi?
Yeah, why do we dip bread in salt when we say hamotzi? So there are two reasons. One is a simple reason, and that simply was that salt makes the bread taste better. They would sometimes bake bread without salt, and therefore, in order to honor the bracha, to show that you're grateful to Hashem, you want to make the bread as tasty as possible, so you dip it in salt. That is why some poskim say if the bread was already made with salt, as is common, there is no chiyuv to dip it in salt, because the bread is already min hamuvchar. I know somebody had a meal with Rav Shechter at YU, and they noticed he didn't dip his challah in salt, and they asked him why. He says, my Rebbetzin's challah is perfect. There's no idea, there's no concept of my having to improve my wife's challah. It's like, it's very rude to ask for ketchup if you're eating at someone's house, right? Ketchup meaning I gotta, add some taste to this chicken or whatever it will be. Now, the other reason is a more deeper reason, and that is Chazal teach us, Shulchan Daimel Mizbeach. A Jewish table, I sit at a meal. This is like a sacrifice I'm giving to Hashem. My table is like an altar. And the same way that we bring the korbanos to serve Hashem, I'm eating and I'm drinking and I'm making brachos. So I should serve Hashem. My eating and my drinking, ideally at least, are a korban to Hashem. And it says every korban has to be salted. That's in the Torah itself. That's actually a mitzvah in the Torah. Now, why that's so is because salt doesn't disintegrate. It's a sign of the eternal bond between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael. Salt does not spoil. But the reason why we do it with our bread is based on Shulchan Domeh Lemizbeach. So according to that, even if this bread already has the salt, you need to be moleach the bread to show that you're regarding your bread as a korban that you're giving to Hashem. Yeah.
Can one put...
No, just a follow-up, yeah.
Another question.
Yeah.
I heard in the shir today that if Hashem can do anything, then can he spell a table, which is a 5-letter word with 4 letters? Have you heard this question?
I'm sorry. Can Hashem do what?
Hashem can do anything, but he can't spell table, the word table, with 4 letters?
Okay, well, this is just a variation of a whole bunch of stuff. Can God commit suicide? Can God make a circle with 3 sides? Can God make a rectangle with 3 sides, or a triangle with 4 sides? Because God can do everything. Can God have a body? In fact, actually, that's a big argument against the Rambam. Right? The Rambam says God does not have a body, cannot have a body. Well, I don't want to sound like an apikoros, but the question is, if God can do anything, why can't he have a body if he wants? Are you saying there's a limitation on what Hashem can do? Okay? So the short answer to that is that even Hashem is bound by what we call logical impossibility as opposed to factual impossibility. Let me give you an example. Can Hashem lift 1 trillion tons? Of course he can. It's true that is physically impossible for anything else. Hashem is not subject to physical impossibility. But Hashem, in some ways, is subject to the laws of logic, which himself he created. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu cannot create a rectangle that has 3 sides, because then it wouldn't be a rectangle. By the same token, God cannot be not God. Now, what is not God? Not God is, I'm finite, I'm material, I don't live forever. That's called not God. God can only be God. God cannot be not God. Therefore, God cannot commit suicide, because if God could kill himself, he would be not God. Now, in Hasidus, they disagree with this whole premise. They say God can do anything. So God could kill himself. God could make round triangles. God could make square triangles, whatever it would be. There's no such thing as nature, because Hashem is the architect of the laws of nature. But at least according to the Rambam, Hashem is bound by the laws of logic and the laws of what Aristotle called the laws of identity. The identity is A can only be A cannot be not A. You see? So that's kind of how you work with those conundrums. But again, it's a very subtle distinction between physical impossibility and logical impossibility. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, when you sing Zemiros, can you use HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name? The answer is, Me'ikar Adin, it is 100% mutter, because when you're praising Hashem, you can use his name. But most people have a custom not to, and there is a basis for it, because depending on the nigun you're using for Zemiros, you sometimes repeat words, repeat sentences, etc. You might repeat the shame, or even in a pasuk, you're saying a line of Hashem's name, but you repeat the line. That's not kavadik. So because of that, most people have the custom not to use the name of Hashem in Zemiros, but from the strict standpoint of halacha, it is considered to be proper. In fact, it's even mutter when you're learning Gemara. If you're learning Gemara, and the Gemara quotes a pasuk, Vayomer Hashem, kach lecha something, you actually say Hashem's name. You say Hashem's name. Again, the minhag is not to for various reasons, but me'ikar adin, when you're maskir the name of Hashem, b'derech kavod, to honor him, to say a pasuk in the Torah, that's going to be mutter. One of the hazards of bar mitzvah boys, maybe you had this experience. Sometimes they train a bar mitzvah boy to lane or whatever it is, or to daven for the amud, but he says Hashem. They tell him, say Hashem, don't say Hashem's name, because you're not davening. So on the day of his bar mitzvah, he's been preparing for a whole year, whatever it would be. In Eretz Yisrael, they spend less time in this, but in America, preparing for bar mitzvah is a gigantic thing. So the kid gets up davening for the Amud, and he starts Chazaras Hashatz, Baruch Atah Hashem. He says Hashem. Has to be corrected, like, because he's so used to it. So in something like that, it actually makes more sense to be mechanechin with the Shem Hashem. Yeah.
Yeah, so during GMO, right, when they're making a fish, but sometimes they like put in a little bit of eel DNA.
Yeah.
If it comes out looking exactly like a fish, but it has both scales and fins, is that the only criteria that we're looking at to decide if it's kosher, since that's what the Torah says we should only be deciding?
Right. So this is a big issue with genetically modified food, GMOs, in which different characteristics from different types of animals are sometimes injected into plants. You can have tomatoes with pig DNA in there for longevity, whatever it is. Or in your example, there may be some eel DNA inside of a fish and the like. So I would say a number of things. I would say in your specific example, I see no problem at all there, because the eel becomes kashered, so to speak, by virtue of the fact that it's now incorporated into an organism that has scales and fins. There may be more of a problem if you did it in a tomato. Even then we would matter because it's microscopic and the like. But the point you're making is a very good point, that even a non-kosher animal, if it has the requisite signs, actually can become kosher by virtue of that. Now, it's not the same thing, but a similar example might be that many kosher fish may eat, right, or even a kosher animal, right? A goat might eat some meat, right? Goats occasionally eat meat. A goat might eat some rat, a dead rat or something like that. So the question becomes, does that make the goat treif? But the answer is no, it gets incorporated into the body of the goat. The goat is a kosher animal, so everything is going to be koshered that way. So I think that's what we would say there, yeah.
Can one put on tefillin in a Reform synagogue?
Can one put on tefillin in a Reform synagogue? Well, of course, you'd have to borrow it from a woman if you didn't bring your own. Only women in the Reform movement wear tefillin. Men tend not to. The short answer is this. I mean, generally speaking, many poskim say you're not even allowed to enter a Reform synagogue because of maris ayin. But even if you enter, you're certainly not supposed to daven there, because once again, that shows as if you're participating in a service. So I think it would kind of depend, meaning you should not put on tefillin in the sanctuary, and you certainly should not do so while a Reform service is being conducted. But if you go out in the hallway or you go into a classroom, I don't see anything wrong with that. The problem is the maris ayin, the appearance that you're participating in the religious service. So as long as you're not in the sanctuary, and maybe even if you're in the sanctuary and there's no service, but let's say you're not in the sanctuary, I don't think there's any problem there. Yeah. Okay, I'll come back. Yeah.
What hilchos of Tuma and Tame do we hold, if any, at the Kotel nowadays? So like before, when the Beis Hamikdash was standing, we were like, Tame, you couldn't go. I mean, I guess we're all Tuma now, but like.
Yeah. So as you know, there is a controversy in Halacha about entering the HaRav, entering the Temple Mount. Most of the Haredi world actually follows psukim that we do not enter the Temple Mount. We go up to the Kotel, but we don't go on the other side. There are others who do, religious people. I'm not talking about non-religious. Religious people who follow a psak that they can go on the other side. So let me just mention that the problem is the following. The kaisel is not the wall of the Beis Hamikdash. And the kaisel is not even the wall of the courtyard around the Beis Hamikdash. The kaisel is the wall around the HaRav in the time of the temple. Now, the halacha is the following. If I am a tamei meis, if I am tamei because I have been in contact with a dead body, and I have not been purified by the para aduma, so I remain tamei my whole life, I'm not allowed to enter the temple or the courtyard around the temple, but I could enter the harabayas up to that point. Meaning, clearly there will be a shetach of the harabayat that's not the azara and it's not the mikdash, and you'd be allowed to go there, although if a woman is a nida or a man had a seminal emission, he wouldn't be allowed to go, but a tamei meis is allowed to go. So the question you'll ask me is, so why do Gedolim say not to go to the harabayat if it's absolutely clear that the outer rim of the harabayat is mutter for a tamei met? So the answer is relatively simple. For sure, there is part of the harabayat that is mutter. But for sure, as you go closer and closer, it'll be part of the harabayat that it is usher, and you're chayiv kares if you cross that boundary. And since there's a lot of uncertainty where that boundary is, most Gedolei Yisrael say, don't go there at all. And those who go there follow the same guideline, except they're more confident. They feel they can identify what areas are okay, what areas are not. Most Gedolim say we shouldn't take a chance. It's like going through a minefield. Let's imagine that there was a minefield here. But I tell you, I studied this, and as long as you stay 3 inches from this line, you're going to be okay. Don't worry about it. Just stay 3 inches. Well, would you be comfortable walking through a minefield based on an instruction that just keep your distance? It's pretty scary. Well, chiyuv kares is a scary thing, right? So I'm willing to say, I am willing to tell you, there is absolutely no question that there are parts of the harabayas that a tamei meis is permitted to go on. Absolutely. It's not true to say the whole harabayas is an isur d'oraisa. That's not true. But it makes sense to be more careful because we don't know exactly where the boundary changes.
But a tuval yom should not go to the kotel itself.
Oh, okay. No. All right. So let me explain. Okay. So when you're talking about...
I'm just talking where we
No. Our side of the kotel. So here's the thing. According to the vast majority of opinions, you are outside of the harabayas. If you're outside of the harabayas, not only can you be a tamei mes, you can even be a balkari. You don't even have to be a tefil yom, even if you didn't go to the mikveh. So most poskim say there are no restrictions whatsoever on any type of tamei going to the outside of the kotel. The one chumrah is don't stick your fingers in the crevices of the rock. So that might be an inyan. If you're a balkari, and you didn't go to the mikveh, there's a makom to be machmir, not to put your fingers in the rock. But in terms of going up to the kotel, we are absolutely makel. Now, not everybody holds that way. There are some people that actually say that even the plaza, part of the plaza, has the status of the harabayas, which would create a lot of chumras. There are such shitas, but we're not nayeg that way. The Gedolei Yisrael, we're not nayeg to have any tumah restrictions on the coastal plaza other than sticking your finger into the rocks.
Underground, they say there's like a minion there sometimes.
Yeah.
And they say there's like, it's like very close to the Holy of Holies.
Yeah, but it'll be this. That's true. It's very close, but it would be the same principle. Meaning, we regard the underground area as equivalent to the Kotel Plaza. So once again, the zahiris would be not to go up to the wall, and stick your hands there. Yeah.
We see sometimes that the Kubalim do certain things that don't seem so regular amongst the Gedolah Yisrael. Let's say maybe not shaking someone's hand for whatever reason it may be. So how do we kind of reconcile that with seeing Gedolim of the past, from Zalman, Moshe, Eliyahu, not doing these things? Meaning we see the Gedolim acting one way, but we see the Gedolah Yisrael who we follow for Halacha not doing that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, once again, I mean, the same way that different Gedolim behave different than each other, so too, if you're connected to a certain branch of Torah, you will have certain nitios and certain inclinations and certain hanhagos that are not necessarily meant to be followed by other people. Meaning, it's not a question of right versus wrong. It's a question of my shitos lead me to a certain hanhaga, but that's not necessarily something other people have to do. Now, it is interesting that you mentioned Rabbi Yashiv as the other camp. You know, one needs to know about the great, deep Kabbalistic background Rabbi Yashiv has. Rabbi Yashiv, of course, is known to us, or was known to us, as the posek halacha par excellence, the posek hador. Right, halacha was his thing. And yet, Rabbi Yashiv's grandfather, Rav Shlomo Yashiv, was the greatest Makubal, one of the last greatest of the Mekubalim, the Leshem, the Baal HaLeshem he's called. He wrote a sefer, Leshem Shavai V'Achlama, which is a very, very detailed and deep commentary on the Ari's Kabbalah and the Zohar. And the Leshem is considered to be one of the great, maybe the last great classic of Kabbalah. So you might just say, well, okay, Rabbi Yashiv had nothing to do with that. Good. The Leshem is a Makubal, Rabbi Yashiv is not. Well, the emes is, when the Leshem was published, I think in the 1920s, he actually writes in his Hakdama that his 12-year-old grandson helped him a lot in compiling the Sefer, and that was the young boy, who wasn't even bar mitzvah yet, Yosef Shalom. So Yosef Shalom, as a 12-year-old, was very close to his grandfather, and he worked on the Leshem. He worked on Kabbalah. So Rabbi Yashiv may have known Kabbalah before he knew Shas, even. He was steeped in Kabbalah. So somebody once asked him years later, does he learn Kabbalah? So he said, what did he say? He says, I know today what I knew then. He was trying to say that he doesn't learn Kabbalah, but it was really fakert. He says, I know now what I knew then, meaning he knew it then as well. So it's interesting that Rabbi Yashiv was a great, he had very great knowledge in Kabbalah. Now, one thing that's very, very fascinating that I found is, according to Kabbalah, it's brought down, you may have heard this, you're not supposed to cross your fingers like this. I'm just doing it for illustration. That's called the Midas Adin. So I saw a video, Rabbi Yashiv was talking and learning, and he Badavka had his hands exactly in that configuration. I almost wish like somebody would ask him about this, because if there's a Hakpada al Pi Kabbalah, he certainly would have been aware of it. So that's very interesting. To me, it was actually a very interesting thing. So when people ask me, because sometimes I also put my fingers that way, people ask me, I always have my defense. Rabbi Yashiv is my defense that allows me to do it. Yeah.
Speaking of Kabbalah, so is there any consensus, I guess academics would have their own thing, but let's say among Gedolim, whether there, that all that, what was I going to say, that, I lost my train of thought, that does it come from Hashem Veichai, we go back there, or it really comes from the 12th to 13th century, it's not, we don't go back. It doesn't really come.
Yeah. The issue of the authorship of the Zohar. Right. The authorship of the Zohar, as you know, has been a controversy for many, many years. Our normal Messiah is that the Zohar is the work of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who died, who was nifter shortly after the Churban Beis Hamikdash in the 1st century of the Common Era, before the Mishnah. That would make the Zohar older than the Mishnah. And yet what happened was that the Zohar seems to have been virtually unknown until the 1200s, more than 1,000 years later, where a great Spanish Makubal, whose name is Rav Moshe de Leon, who wrote his own books on Kabbalah, he actually wrote his own books on Kabbalah, claims to have discovered this manuscript in a cave, a hidden manuscript of the teachings of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, and that became the book that was known as the Zohar. So ever since the discovery of the Zohar in the 1200s, there's been a tremendous debate. Is it really Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? Or is it the work of Rav Moshe de Leon? Now, the truth of the matter is, in some ways, this becomes less and less important, because even if it's Rav Moshe de Leon's work, it's already more than 900 years old. And so the point is, it becomes a holy work anyway, because everybody used it, the Arizal and the Gra. And so it almost makes no difference who wrote it, because its teachings have been sanctified by Gedolah Yisrael for many, many generations. But all I can say is that, the Arizal and the Gra and the Ramchal all took the position it is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rav Yaakov Emden, who was very independent gadol anyway, he took the position it's Rav Moshe de Leon. So there is a machlokas, although most connected to Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. But I do want to add one thing that I think is an important corrective. Even if you say it's Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, that does not mean every word of the Zohar is Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. That means the core of the Zohar is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It is obvious that additions were made later, because there are Amoraim who are mentioned in the Zohar, who lived several hundred years after Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. So, just like Tehillim, we say Tehillim is written by David HaMelech. But Chazal already say there were actually 10 elders who wrote different Tehillim, Adam Arishon and Avram Avinu and later. So when you identify a book as being written by somebody, you're saying the core of the book was written by somebody, but it's shaykh, there were other editors, other writers. So I think it's a davar pashat ma'id that even those who say Rav Shimon Bar Yochai are moda, that there were haisafas, but no later than them Maharal, meaning nobody, they wouldn't say as late as Rav Moshe de Leon and the like. Yeah.
We besides Kabbalah and the Tanya and Der Hashem, where else could you find that this idea that there's a chelik elikid in us? That this is God within us?
Yeah, so the idea that our neshamos are the breath of God, a chelek eloka mima'al. So where do you find those ideas? Well, I mean, the main places are where you what you said. The Tanya, of course, is a classic sefer about that. Ramchal and Derech Hashem, and in Das Tavunos. I would just add Nefesh HaChaim. Look at besides, like
within like the Talmud, or
in other words, you want to look for an earlier source.
Rishonim, perhaps. Or
Well, the Mekubal, I mean, the Zohar again. It depends how early you put the Zohar, but the Zohar.
Besides Zohar, besides like.
It's one of those things where once you have the idea, you'll then understand many statements in light of that idea, but you don't necessarily have the idea stated in that way. So that's why we have these later Seforim, and they tell us how to read the earlier Makoros. Okay? Yeah. You didn't mention Nefesh HaChaim, but you're right. But Nefesh HaChaim would be a book that you would add to it.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.